There are literally talks right now of establishing an official position of like Euro-Caliph, you know, the head of European Muslims. So there you go. I mean, we're literally a few steps away from having a legit caliphate. Greetings, this is Eugene the Philosopher, the greatest living philosopher after the unfortunate passing of Quentin Robert de Nameland, who has been the greatest living philosopher before me. In this video, I wish to continue the line I've started in my video, How Europe Will Rule the World, or something like that. So we'll talk about Europe again and its rising influence in the next 50 years, roughly, alright? So, but like a special subject of that, like a subtopic of that would be Islam. So, what are the relationships of Europe with Islam? You've probably heard that there's a huge problem of Islamization of Europe, that Muslims are running all over the streets, having fun with European women, like ruining the cities, burning cars, etc., etc. So this seemingly contradicts what I say about the European domination of the world, right? And I mean, logically so, but I would say that the problem, and this is kind of the point of this video, that this problem is actually overblown by propaganda, both in terms of scale, i.e. there aren't actually that many migrants in the first place, and in terms of its cultural significance, if you wish, and political significance. In fact, there is a big positive part to Islamization of Europe that people somehow ignore, but which I specifically want to highlight in this video, alright? So, well, as a caveat before we begin, this is obviously a multi-layered problem, right? So it involves many factors and circumstances, and it's not entirely determined by the will of any like single actor, right? It's just a phenomenon that involves many powers, like sort of in a weird dance together. I mean, the migration of Muslims to Europe and everything that follows from it, all right? And that would follow afterwards, which I'm gonna highlight down below. So, European elites are actually not against migration from Africa and the Middle East, Northern Africa first and foremost, to Europe, because, well, migrants are actually a big problem for the United States, sure, but they aren't such a big problem for Europe, and there are many reasons for that. One of the reasons is that the Europeans have sort of like a moral superiority in this case over in this situation at least, with respect to the Americans, I mean. So the migrants to the EU are doing so, migrating voluntarily, right? Which is not the case with with the United States, where you can make claims, and Europeans will make those claims in the coming decades, that, you know, their aggressive war against Mexico, like with the territorial like claims, and you might say, well, Mexicans are actually kind of coming to their own land previously, etc., etc. And obviously slavery, where people also were not exactly voluntarily transferred to the United States, etc., etc. So Europeans are just like, well, migrants welcome, like whoever wanna come can come, right? So it's a completely different, it's a moral higher ground with respect to the America, right? So yeah, and the other factor is statistics. Like in European statistics, for example, race is rarely mentioned actually, like, you know, we're all French kind of sentiment. So it's a good safeguard against identity politics and things like that, all these disruptive measures that actually Europeans use against the Americans, right, in the first place. So, but America is inherently a racist state, so for Americans this is a big issue, you know, the racial differences between the like native citizens and migrants. I mean native obviously because the proverbial white Americans are also not really native, right? Okay, so yeah, so a brief story of what was happening in the 20th century. So colonialism was pretty much prohibited by the United States, all right, after the World War II. So there was a process, the process was called decolonization, obviously. It took place like roughly in 1950s throughout 1970s, roughly, right? I mean, arguably it started even earlier, because like when India became independent, right? Not really, I mean, so the British Empire has transitioned into the Commonwealth, right? So the process has ended in 1949. And the other European nations have lost their colonies as well. So basically what decolonization means is Americans are beating Europeans all over the globe, right? They're cutting their ties to their previous colonies. So yeah, well, America was the hegemon after the World War II, so they could dictate their conditions pretty much to everyone, right? Their Monroe Doctrine, enforce it to every other country, basically, right? So the question is, how would Europeans continue to develop their empires, so to speak, to spread their influence in these conditions, where they are explicitly prohibited from having colonies? Right. So, well, just like that, actually, you know, through cultural influence, through the creation of a class of essentially European citizens, but ethnically coming from the colonies, right? So these European citizens, I mean the migrants to the EU, could later migrate back home from Europe, already having this European operational system, so to speak, installed, right? Having the European culture codes in them. Something like that. So that later, after the American hegemony would end, which would happen in the coming decades, maybe 20 to 70 years. I mean, that's a pretty big margin, but something like that. I mean, on average, you might say 50 or something like that. So yeah, after that, this process would happen, like the reverse migration. And what would happen is that the European Union will get these territories back essentially for free, right? Because the ruling class would be European there, even though ethnically it wouldn't be, right? So that's the idea, essentially. And you can see the example of that with Israel, right? Israel and Judaism, where, like, how was Israel established? Well, exactly like that. Like, after World War II, when British hegemony has ceased, the European Jews simply colonized the place, right? So they literally migrated in millions into the modern day Israel. But the problem was obviously that there were already Muslims living there, right? And the problem still persists, as you may well know. But what if they were not Jews and Muslims, but what if the Muslims migrated to Israel? It would be fine, I think, right? So that's what is going to happen to, let's say, Northern Africa and the Middle East in the near future, again, during the decay of American hegemony. So it would be a recolonization by the hands of current migrants in the EU. Basically, that's the idea. This is the tool of colonialism, essentially. You might say post-colonialism or something like that. And here I wish to introduce the concept of Eurabia. So that's like Europe plus Arabia, right? Now, what is understood by this term right now is a conspiracy theory dealing with the demolition of European civilization through the injection of Islam, right? So the concept of Eurabia is that they want to kill the European civilization by, flooding Europe with the migrants, Muslim migrants, right? Something like that. But considering what I've said above, the injection of Islam can actually only strengthen Europe in the long run, right? Or again, in the horizon of like decades to hundreds of years. So yeah, actually the word Eurabia itself was popularized after 9/11, understandably so, right? By a married couple of British intelligence officers. So it was a sort of like a humanitarian aid to Americans, all right? So essentially it was an ideological support for the American invasion of the Middle East, which happened again after 9/11. Again, the objective of the invasion in the first place was obviously the disruption of European influence there in the Middle East, and obviously also cutting the supply of oil and gas from Middle East to EU and China simultaneously. So yeah, and essentially war and terror is American attempts at preventing this Eurabization, if you wish. And you may remember, like in early 2000s, there was a big propaganda campaign again, underdevelopment by the United States to promote Islamophobia in Europe, right? For example, look at the media coverage of Paris riots of 2005, right? With some really, really crazy headlines. Like, for example, like the French police back then, actually after the investigation, they've concluded and they've stated that these riots have nothing to do with Islam, but the American media continue to like emphasize this point. Oh, it's like the evil Islamists like burning cars, etc., etc. So, and it's the clash of civilizations, and Europe is losing, etc., etc. So yeah, same was happening in Arab Spring, right, 2010s. Like where again, which is another attempt of Americans at disrupting, at cutting European ties to Muslim world, or the Syrian war, right, or like the migrant crisis of 2015, etc., etc. Again, this Islamophobic campaign of American media. So, continuing Syrian war is obviously yet another like a boot in the door, American boot in the closing door of Eurabization, if you wish. So, yeah. It's yet another American attempt to create problems in European backyard. And Europeans still don't have an army, right? So they cannot respond to the American invasion. So what the only thing they can do is use proxy, like proxy agents, such as Russian army, for example, which they exactly did in Syria. So Russian army was essentially controlled by European Union in Syria. Just like it is right now in Ukraine, by the way. So, as I've said, see my video, Ukraine Special, for example, where I say that the war in Ukraine is actually the proxy war between the EU and the US, where, roughly speaking, if you oversimplify, like completely paint everything black and white, Russian army is European army and Ukrainian army is the American army, right? But, I mean, very, very roughly speaking. Obviously, in the reality, it's much more complex than that. But, yeah. So, yeah. So returning to the topic of Eurabia, right? As we've said many times on this channel, the national states are going to decay in the very near future, and we'll have and the globalization would fail as well, right? Because the globalization, what is globalization? It's essentially a tool of American hegemony, right? So if there's no American hegemony, there's no globalization. That's pretty much it. So what we're going to have instead is at least four macro regions, right? So these are like areas on the globe where roughly 2 billion people live, or something like that. Roughly, again, maybe 1.5 to 2 or something to that effect. So four macro regions are obviously like the Greater India, the Europe or Eurabia, as we've learned already, China and America, right? So perhaps like the Pacific and Sub-Saharan Africa would also become macro regions of their own, but it's kind of doubtful. Well, Sub-Saharan Africa would, most likely, but it still isn't, right? But there are some, like, you know, some developments in this area. So why I'm saying Sub-Saharan? Because again, everything to the north of Sahara is going to be part of the European Union, essentially. Because, well, Northern Africa was always part of the European civilization, you know, ever since ancient Rome at the very least. So they'll become a natural part of the EU. A natural southern border of Europe is Sahara Desert, right? It's not the Mediterranean, like, shores. Just like the natural eastern border of Europe is Ural Mountains, right? So western parts of Russia, Belarus, Ukraine, they would also become part of Europe, essentially, at some point. Yeah. So speaking about these four macro regions, like China is already losing its population, right? So it's on the decline pretty much. So we need a new production center for the world in the coming decades, and obviously India would become the next China, literally in the next like 15 to 20 years. Like, I mean, it would start even much earlier than that, but it would probably peak in like 20 years from now, or maybe well, I don't know, something like that, I think. So India would become the motor in the next decades, during which America would switch to sub-hegemon, right? And Europe would start dominating pretty much until the end of the century and beyond. And after this century, as we've learned from previous video, history would end anyway, so nobody would care anymore, right? We'll start colonizing other places. So yeah. And speaking of globalization and the demise of globalization, another thing that would demise is tourism. Maybe we'll talk about this some other time. Aviation would get a huge hit, you know, like the jet planes would start dwindling, you know, flying in planes would become a bad thing, traveling by planes, I mean. So that's why Greta is needed, right? Greta plays a role of this Joan of Arc, so to speak. I mean, she's coming from a family of actors, right? So she's an actress, essentially, enkindling, how do you call it? Rekindling the flame of Joan of Arc, so to speak. Getting rid of the evil Brits, aka Americans, from Europe, right? We don't need your dirty planes right here. Because what are planes? It's again tools of globalization and a way for the American to get to the civilized world, right? But in Europe, people are already in the civilized world. They don't have to go anywhere, so they can perfectly fine travel with railways, right? High-speed nuclear-powered railways. So that's the European way. Railways, the European way, you know. Yeah. So. And getting up a level, so there is a philosopher, not philosopher by the way, in Europe, Jürgen Habermas, who's pretty much the official philosopher of European Union. And if you read him, you'll pretty much understand just literally what I've said. He almost plainly talks about the future program of the EU. And it includes pretty much what I've said, right? And so far, what he said was pretty much on point. So he talks about the importance of, he's a official philosopher of European Union just in the way as Hegel was the official philosopher of Prussia, right? So he talks about the importance of Euro-Islam. And you can understand this differently, like Islamization of Europe. And then you may cry, following the American media and say, oh, this is bad, our civilization is dying. Or you might consider this as Europeization of Islam itself, alright? And that's an interesting take. And this is pretty much the take I'm taking, forgive me for this tautology, in this video, alright? So, and the words about the European non-hegemony are Habermas's words. I mean, he didn't formulate it like this, but the point was there, essentially. So, what do I mean by Europeization of Islam? Well, it's an attempt to finally patch together the East and West Roman Empire, if you wish. So, the East is Islam, and the West is Christianity, right? So it's an attempt to reverse this 700-year trend of fracturing of stuff. Well, 700 years according to alternative history. I mean, considering 3rd century equals to 13th century. That's what I mean. Then it would be 700. So we've had the Roman Empire, then it became separated into the Western, aka Christian, and Eastern, aka Muslim Roman Empire, and then both became fractured into national states, well, especially the Christian one, right? And then the trend starts to reverse, and from the national states we get what? European Union, right? And now it's time to unite the European Union with the Eastern Roman Empire, the Ottoman Empire, you know. So, yeah, so the Muslims were dreaming about the Caliphate, you know, for hundreds of years. Well, now guess what? Now you can do it within the European Union, the Caliphate, I mean. I mean, there are literally talks right now of establishing an official position of Euro-Caliph, you know, the head of European Muslims. So there you go. I mean, we're literally a few steps away from having a legit caliphate. So you want a caliphate? Please join the EU. I mean, migrants welcome. Like, we welcome everyone, right? So it would be a huge step, this reintegration of the Roman Empire on a whole other level, essentially. Both post-religious, you might say, and even post-secular. And it would happen inevitably in the next 70 years or so. So, hail Eurabia. Thank you for watching. The eons are closing.